gonna end the practice session. So Matt, people will start flowing in now. But have fun. I'm excited to watch.
Mm-hmm. Perfect, that's great. As we have people joining us here, I'd just like to say thank you for joining us today, and we'll get started very, very shortly. I'll introduce our speaker today and and welcome you. Just before we do that, just if you do have any questions throughout, I'm here to ask those to Todd, but I'll probably leave those to the end. So feel free to put those in the chat as we go along today. It'd be great to have some discussion and to find out sort of what people are thinking at this time and at this stage. So yeah, please feel free to drop those messages in the chat as we go. So my start here, I just mind to introduce myself. I'm Matt Hill with Business Link, and I want to thank you for joining us on the webinar today. At Business Link, we're honoured to provide services to all entrepreneurs and specialty services for immigrant and Indigenous entrepreneurs. We're inclusive in our cultural understanding and awareness of the histories of our country. With that, we'll start the event with a land acknowledgement to recognise all of Alberta. We want to acknowledge that in the province of Alberta, we're situated on the traditional territories of Treaties 4, 6, 7, 8 and 10, ancestral homeland of our diverse First Nation groups, Métis and Indigenous people whose ancestors have walked this land since time immemorial, and whose histories, languages and cultures continue to influence our vibrant community. We pay respects to the Indigenous people of this land, past, present and future, while recognising their cultural heritage, history, beliefs and relationships to the land on which we reside. Thank you for joining us, like I say, on the webinar today. Todd Hirsch is going to be speaking today on the topic of Alberta's economy, what to expect in 2020. I'll introduce Todd more in a moment, but just like I say, please feel free to use the chat function. It's great and things come to life when we have questions and can get feedback from you. So I'll be monitoring that and ask those at the end. Like I say, it's a pleasure to introduce our presenter. Todd is the Vice President and Chief Economist with ATB. So thanks for joining us today, Todd. He holds degrees in economics from the University of Alberta and the University of Calgary. And for over 20 years, he's worked as an economist at numerous organizations, including the Canada West Foundation and the Bank of Canada. He's also the author of 3 books. His latest, Spiders in Space, Successfully Adapting to Unwanted Change. It was released in 2017. Sounds pretty prescient for these times though. Todd is a strong advocate in the arts and culture community. He's the board chair of the Calgary Arts Academy and serves on the board of the Glenbow Museum and Alberta Ballet. So with sort of without any further ado, I'll pass you over to Todd as we enjoy his presentation today.
Well, thank you so much, Matt, for that very kind introduction, and thank you to Business Link for inviting me to be part of this webinar. Obviously, the economy is a hot topic these days, and there's a lot to talk about. The tumultuous year we came through last year, very unexpected, and now as we're into 2021, a lot of questions are arising as to the timing of economic recovery and what, in fact, it's going to look like. Let me go ahead and share my, hold on. Yes, I'm going to share my screen here and my presentation. And Matt, do you want to just give me a verbal okay that the big purple screen is up there?
Yeah, you're good. Yeah, we can see that.
That's good.
Thanks.
All right. Thank you. So the title of my presentation, Alberta's Economy 2021, Tools to Help Make Sense of It All. I love this quote here from President Dwight Eisenhower. Plans are useless, but planning is indispensable. And I think that really is a wise way to think about it. Plans as a static noun, as a thing that we make, are useless, but planning as an active verb as the situation changes. That is where the value is. So I'm going to sort of borrow that quote and come up with predictions are useless, especially when I think back to my predictions about a year ago, January of 2020. My predictions for the year turned out to be useless, but we never stop predicting. In other words, we change our predictions. We actively are always revising and looking at new data as the situation changes. And we saw a lot of change in 2020. The tools that I'm going to use this morning to help us understand what's going on in Alberta's economy this year, they don't look much like the tools in the carpenter's tool belt, but rather the butterfly, the alphabet, and a 4-layer sponge cake. These are going to help us understand some of the really interesting dynamics that I think are going to shape this year for Alberta. Let's start first of all with the butterfly. Now, many of you have no doubt heard of the butterfly effect, this notion taken from chaos theory. The saying goes that a butterfly flaps its wings in Africa and it creates a hurricane somewhere else in the world. And the basic idea here is that a very small, sometimes small, insignificant action in one spot of the world can have a ripple effect, a multiplier effect that continues to build and build and build until it finally creates a hurricane in some remote location. Well, we're not going to talk about butterflies in Africa, but there was a situation somewhere in North America early this year that actually is having a big impact on us here in Alberta. The event was in Georgia on January 5th. And as many of you know, there was a Senate runoff for 2 vacant Senate seats, a runoff in the state of Georgia. Now, the Republicans were expected to take both of those seats or hold on to both of those seats. But in fact, the Democrats, a bit surprisingly, they took both of those seats. That changes the equation for us here in Alberta. And it all has to do with this, the Keystone XL pipeline. Now, no doubt many of you are aware that the Keystone XL pipeline has been on again, off again for almost a decade, maybe even more than a decade. President Obama, famous for having canceled the project. Donald Trump, also famous for revising the project. And now we have President-elect Biden, who has campaigned against the Keystone XL pipeline. What changes with the Senate result in Georgia is that now, a bit surprisingly, it is a blue sweep of Washington. The White House, the House of Representatives, and now the Senate are all controlled by the Democrats. This gives President-elect Biden a lot more leeway in pushing his environmental agenda, the new Green Deal, as they call it. And as his energy minister, she is quite opposed to pipelines in general. Now, before Christmas and before the Senate election in Georgia, I was suggesting that the Keystone XL pipeline was still more likely to go ahead. My reasoning was that President Biden would need some compromise. He would need some cards to play, some ace cards to play, in order to achieve his broader vision of his new Green Deal. Tougher regulations on greenhouse gases, tougher regulations on shale oil deposits and fracking and oil production in the United States. And I view the Keystone XL pipeline, which is already well underway, as a logical bargaining chip that President Biden could have used in order to gain Senate support from the Republicans. But now, with the Democrats controlling the Senate, he is not nearly as much in need of that bargaining chip anymore. And to me, this puts the future of the Keystone XL pipeline in serious question. If before Christmas I was saying it was more likely to go ahead, I am now suggesting it is less likely to go ahead. Now, that is causing some alarm here in Alberta, because obviously when we think about capacity, access to markets for our oil, the Keystone XL pipeline for a decade was expected to be a big part of that. The ability to move our heavy oil, our bitumen, from a gathering point at Hardisty, Alberta, down to the Gulf Coast. But I don't think that when we think about the energy sector in Alberta and the Biden administration, even if Keystone is canceled, I would still suggest that on balance, there's probably more good news for our industry than bad news. The Keystone XL pipeline is a negative, but when we think about Alberta's competitive position relative to the United States, part of the big challenge during the Trump era was that Donald Trump had reduced regulation and eliminated a lot of the barriers to capital flowing into fracking and to shale oils in the United States. That had put Canada at a real competitive disadvantage. And that's why for 4 years, we've seen a lot of outflow of capital, of money, of drilling rigs, of people stateside because it is more competitive. President-elect Biden and the new Green Deal could change all of that and is likely to make the playing field much more even for Canada. In other words, without us here in Canada having to do a single thing, we are now gaining a competitive advantage relative to the United States. And it is because of President-elect Biden's strong platform on the environment, the tougher regulations on fracking and on shale oil extraction. The other reason why I think Alberta, on balance, the Biden election or the Biden win is good news, is that oil prices are likely to firm up. Remember that Mr. Biden's policies around the energy industry are likely to be more restrictive. That is going to reduce the amount of shale and fracking that shale oil production and fracking that we see. That is going to, in my belief, curtail some supply from the United States, from those American drillers, and that on balance should help push up prices. So, I mean, it's a bit of a complicated calculus when you think about all of the different variables and the different effects. But I don't think, even if we do see the Keystone XL pipeline canceled, I think the Biden administration and the new Green Deal actually offer more optimism than pessimism for our industry. All right, the second tool that I want to use to talk about the economy this year, the alphabet. Now, as many of you know, economists, we love using letters of the alphabet to describe recessions and recoveries. We often talk about a V-shaped recovery. This is how I would depict the recession of 2008, 2009. That financial crisis, that global financial crisis for Alberta, it was a very steep, a very deep recession, but a very rapid rebound in 2010, a classic kind of V-shape. Sometimes we talk about a U-shaped recovery, where it takes a lot longer for the economy to get going again. Sometimes it's a W, a double dip recession. Sometimes it's the dreaded L-shaped recession, where there is really just no recovery anytime on the horizon. But in this recession, and in 2021, the letter we want to talk about is this one here, K. And K is kind of a new letter of the alphabet that economists have been using, new to describe what's happening in 2021, and not just in Alberta, but globally. And let me explain. Back at the beginning of 2020, we saw in March the COVID-19 pandemic dig its heels in, a very sudden and abrupt closure of the economy here in Alberta, across the country, across the world, really. And that led in the second quarter of 2020, that April, May, June period, a very steep and abrupt drop in economic activity. In Alberta, that drop was probably close to 10 to 15%, as we just saw a very instant shutdown of the economy. Q3 and Q4, in other words, the second half of 2020, we saw some stabilization. In other words, things didn't spiral downward any further, but they also did not recover. The stabilizing effect, I think, was largely due to the government support programs, the CERB, the CIBA, the CEWS, all of the different acronyms we use to describe the immediate financial aid for individuals and also for businesses. That was absolutely pivotal in stabilizing the economy. Into 2021, now we've got some interesting questions related to the rollout of the vaccine, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. But the vaccine, we do know, is being rolled out, but it's creating some questions around the timing. When do we see the economy opening back up? When are we able to achieve herd immunity? All of those things still remain uncertain, but we're pretty confident that by the second half of 2021, in other words, after the summer, into the fall and winter, that we will see the economy start to open up. And then we start to see a bifurcation. Bifurcation, a great word economists like to use, meaning things branch off in two different directions. There is going to be a strong recovery for some workers, particularly knowledge workers, professional occupations, basically higher income earners. Throughout COVID, we've talked a lot about people working from home. And in fact, it is only about 25 to 30% of Canadian workers that are actually able to work from home. Their jobs allow them to work from home. They have the technology to work remotely. And those workers tend to be higher income. And generally speaking, they have been disrupted less by COVID. Now, their lives have been disrupted for sure. They've had to stay at home. They've had to do homeschooling, all kinds of things restricting mobility. I don't want to suggest it's been easy, but generally their income and their jobs have not been disrupted to the same degree. When we see the recovery in the second half of 2021, their recovery is going to be swifter and it is going to be stronger. And for some of those workers, it is going to feel like the roaring 20s. They've amassed a lot of savings. 2020 was a record year, in fact, for household savings. About $200 billion, about 10% of the economy, has been stashed away in people's savings account. But that $200 billion has not been spread evenly across all Canadians. It's tended to be concentrated by those workers who did not lose work. And they've been saving money basically because they haven't had anything really to spend money on. They haven't been able to travel. They haven't been able to go out and do things that they'd normally like to do, like eating out or sporting events. So almost by default, they've been saving money. When the economy opens up, these workers are likely to experience a bit of a bonanza, a stronger recovery. They're going to, my guess is, be very, very happy to get out there spending money again on all of those activities that they were not allowed to do during COVID. However, there is another story, a less happy story to talk about, a non-recovery for other workers. And this could be quite troubling, quite worrying. Mostly concentrated in the service sector, in industries like food and beverage, things like accommodation, aspects of the construction industry, the energy industry, some in healthcare. Most of these jobs part-time, most of them lower skill set and lower income. These are the workers that were hit hardest by the lockdown in 2020 and continuing into 2021. The unemployment rate is close to 20% in some of these sectors. And the only reason a lot of these workers have been able to get by at all is because of the government income support. But we know those income support programs are going to come to an end at some point in 2021. They have to come to an end. And that, in fact, could push a lot of these workers into more dire circumstance. A lot of those jobs in the service sector, restaurants, for example, or some retail jobs, some jobs still in tourism, they're not likely to come back anytime soon. Certainly not as immediately as the second half of 2021. So that could push a non-recovery for other workers where in fact they still aren't working and the government income support ends. So a K-shaped recovery. Now, some of you out there might be thinking, oh, well, I'm probably going to be in that recovery bit at the top, the knowledge workers, or maybe you have technology to work remotely. So the temptation might be to think, well, I don't need to worry about this. But I think, in fact, every one of us, if we're in the recovery or the non-recovery group, every one of us, we need to pay attention to this, and we need to be mindful of the problems that this is going to create. Already before COVID, there has been a growing disparity of income and opportunity across the OECD countries. Some countries like the United States, that income gap is wider. But generally speaking, it's been growing everywhere, including here in Canada. And my worry is that the COVID pandemic and post-COVID recovery, we are going to see an acceleration of that income gap. In other words, the rich getting richer and the poor continuing to struggle. And when we see, in any society, when we see that gap of income and opportunity grow so wide, invariably it leads to all kinds of social and political problems. So we have to pay attention to this. I'll be honest, I'm not sure what the solution is to this. I think at some point in the future, probably in 2022 or beyond, we as Canadians are going to have an adult conversation about revising our system of income support, which right now is kind of a hodgepodge patchwork quilt across all levels of government, dozens and dozens and dozens of income support programs. I think it's time to consolidate a lot of these and look at what makes sense for income support in the 21st century. But that question and that debate is for another presentation. So a K-shaped recovery is, I think, what we can anticipate starting sometime in the second half of 2021. The final tool I want to use to talk about, and I'll be brief with this one because I know we're running out of time, the 4-layer sponge cake. Now for this, I need to give credit to a British economist, Hazel Henderson. She pioneered this idea of layers of the economy almost 40 years ago, and she even used the cake metaphor. So this is not my original idea, I have to give her credit. But I think it's an interesting way to think about our economy and the interactions between the different levels of the economy. And what are these levels? Well, let's talk about that first one. That top layer, the one that attracts our eye with all that beautiful fruit at the top. This is really kind of the most attractive part of the cake. That's the market economy, otherwise known as the private sector. And usually when we talk about the economy, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about industries like the technology sector, financial markets, resource like oil and gas extraction, real estate, entertainment, personal services, agriculture. All of those things we would call the private sector, the market economy, and largely where most of us derive our income and our jobs and occupations. So it's a pretty significant piece of the economy, but it's not the only one. Supporting that, the next layer down, the non-market economy, also known as the public sector. These are things that are also really important that we have in place. Things like infrastructure, public education, universities, roads, public transport, aspects of the arts and culture, healthcare, parks, fire, police. These are things that are so essential, in fact, that generally we don't allow the free market to manage because we tend to underproduce them. Instead, these public goods, as economists call them, are generally best operated through government. Collectively, as citizens, we allow governments to tax us to pay for these things that support the market economy on top. But underneath that, the third layer is one that I think often gets the least amount of attention, but perhaps in the 21st century is going to become even more important, the social economy, also known as the community. This is your network of family, of friends. These are volunteers in the economy. Public health and wellness. This is where the COVID pandemic would live. Faith communities, charity, altruism, social organizations. If these things, like public health and wellness, if some of these things break down, we start to see the other two layers of the economy on top of it not being able to operate optimally. And finally, at the very bottom, one that is often forgotten, but not by many people, in fact, is the natural environment, also known as the planet. This is our fresh air, freshwater resources, healthy oceans, soil, forests and trees, land use, carbon sinks, and this is where the debate around climate change and greenhouse gases is. So all of these levels of the economy are important in supporting the market economy at the top. Now, sometimes when we think about these 4 layers of the economy, we can think about the order of foundation. And I've put the word foundation in quotations on purpose. I don't want to use the word importance, because if you start to, ask, well, which is more important, polar bear habitat or my ability to have a job to provide food and shelter for my family? You often hear, especially debates around climate change, you often hear it kind of devolve into that. What's more important? Questions of importance are impossible to answer. But I think we do need to think about, rather than thinking about one layer being more important than the other, we need to think about what layers are more foundational. And I would stack it up this way. The natural environment, if we don't have a planet in which to live, and we don't have fresh air to breathe or clean water to drink, none of it matters. None of those other layers on top are going to operate if our natural environment becomes too impaired and too compromised. The same thing with community, the next foundational level up. If we don't have social connections, if we don't have a cohesive society that even respects things like democracy and rule of law, if we don't have a healthy society, in other words, pandemics are left to ravage the health of individuals. If that community level becomes impaired, the yellow and orange bits on top aren't able to operate. And so we go all the way to the top at the market. Now, again, just because the market is the smallest box, I don't want to suggest it's not important. It's very important. And most of us would say, well, this is where our jobs are. It's just that it is not as foundational. In other words, you don't need Google to be operating in order to have fresh air. In fact, if all of us went away, the natural environment would do just fine on its own. But I think you understand the point I'm making. However, often when we have policy debates, our priorities look like this. And there's a natural reason for this. We tend to put the most priority on policies that support the market economy. And again, there's nothing evil or nothing insidious about this. It's natural that because this is where most of us live and breathe and earn our paychecks, this is naturally where we would like to see priority placed. But we have to understand that if we put less and less and less priority on those other layers, those foundational layers towards the bottom, the cake is going to become unstable. Some of you might be fans of the show Cake Wars. It's a really fun show to watch. It's one of these, it's sort of a cooking game show or contest on one of the cooking channels, I don't know. But the contestants, they come up with these elaborate cakes, unbelievable ornate cakes, most of them quite tall. And invariably, if they run into trouble, the cake starts to tip over and sometimes it topples over, it falls over, always because the foundations were not supportive enough. So I think this is a good way to think about the 4 layers of our economy, the priority we put on them, but understanding the foundations at the bottom need to be stable and secure. So just to wrap up, some forecasts for 2021. And here's where I'm not going to offer predictions, but I will be predicting. In other words, this is an active verb, and I'm more than happy to alter my predicting as the year unfolds. We do see economic growth resuming in Alberta, probably around 3% real GDP growth this year as the vaccine rolls out. But there are serious questions about the timing and the coverage of the vaccine. We know at the moment that health services are busy trying to get as many vaccines into people as possible. I would suggest we are, as a country and as a province, we're probably behind where we thought we would be. It's proving to be a little bit more challenging, in fact, getting all these vaccines stuck into people's arms. But so the timing of the vaccine rollout matters, also coverage matters. And here is, I'm a little bit concerned about the recent polls I've heard. 66% of Canadians in a recent poll said without question they will get the vaccine. But that leaves 34% of Canadians that are unsure or decidedly not going to get the vaccine. Now, the epidemiologists, they tell us that in order for us as a society to achieve herd immunity, we need 60 to 70% vaccination. We don't need 100%, but we need to get to that 60 to 70% level. But we're only at 66% who said they're going to do it for sure. So I think there is some question out there about if we have insufficient coverage. In other words, if too few people are willing to take the vaccine, that could, I think it's going to delay the economic recovery because it will delay the ability of government to reopen the economy. So there's some questions there, but I think they'll get sorted out. We do see that growth slow in the first half of 2021, but then picking up quite sharply in the second half. The jobless rate is going to remain high, probably around double digits, but again, it will matter who you are. Think about that K-shaped recovery. If you're in that top part, the unemployment rate is likely to fall back down to 6 or 7%, not too far off normal, in fact. But if you are not in that group, if you're in that lower income group, the unemployment rate could still remain well above 10%, maybe even around 15%. So it matters who you are and what industry you're in. The energy sector is mostly stable, but at a low level. So even with the downturn we saw in oil prices 6 or 7 years ago, 2015, the energy sector has struggled in Alberta. It's really almost a shadow of what it used to be in terms of how much capital is going into new projects. But I do think we will see it stabilize. We're seeing oil prices well above $50 a barrel in recent days. Some of that due to Saudi Arabia's commitment to withhold some oil. But I also think that the Biden administration and the tougher rules around oil extraction in the US have also pushed those oil prices up. But it is, so I think we will see some stability, but at a lower level than what we would have seen maybe 10 years ago. And the good news, the economy is going to continue to evolve and adapt as we move through COVID and into the post-COVID economy. And very quickly, I'm going to give my top 3 sectors where I see a lot of activity and a lot of growth this year and beyond. The first, technology and digital sectors. Now, this is not new to Alberta. We've had a tech sector here long before COVID, but we are early days, I think, at least compared to other places around the world like Waterloo, Ontario, or Vancouver, or Austin, Texas. But we are growing our tech sector. We've had some very high-profile tech companies like here in Calgary, Benevity, achieving that billion-dollar valuation status, that quote unicorn of a tech sector. And I think that is going to continue to support growth and attracting new tech sectors. So that's the first one. The second one, agriculture and agri-foods. Now, I've always been a big fan of agriculture as a growth industry in Alberta. The traditional agriculture, that's the wheat, the canola, the cattle, that's mostly stable. But where we're going to see more growth is in approximately 30% of farm cash receipts that is now being represented by a growing diversity of new kinds of crops, some of them new to Alberta, some of them not so new. But we are seeing greater diversity, things like cannabis, things like pulses and beans and chickpeas, things like vegetables, notably potatoes. And then we springboard from that into agri-foods. This is the manufacturing piece of agriculture, food and beverage processing, which has now overtaken refined petroleum in Alberta in terms of value. And I think it's only going to continue to grow. And finally, renewable energy and clean energy technologies. Now, Alberta, rightly or wrongly, we have developed a poor reputation, I would say, in the rest of the country, maybe the rest of the world. We're seen as a one-trick pony, fossil fuel extraction, oil and gas, greenhouse gases. This is the perception of Alberta. But I think the reality is that we are increasingly developing a very, very strong renewable energy sector and clean energy technologies. And some of it isn't even new. When we think about wind technology or wind power, the first wind farm was built in Alberta 28 years ago, which if you think about it, I mean, that's kind of a mature industry already. This isn't a startup. But we are investing as a province. We're seeing more and more activity, more and more interest in things like geothermal energy, also hydrogen. Now, we are early days in those, but I think there's a lot of scope for growth, but also clean energy technologies. So here is where we are applying technology to our traditional hydrocarbon industries, oil and gas, to make them far more environmentally acceptable and far less carbon intensive. So things like carbon capture. So all of these things, I think, are a growth industry in Alberta. They are not replacing oil and gas, but they are adding to oil and gas, diversifying our energy industry, diversifying our economy, and hopefully working to repair some of the reputational damage. That's at least what I'm hoping, that Alberta, I think, has suffered in the past. All right. So with that, I want to conclude. I want to thank you for your attention. A very quick little plug for a podcast that I have. We released the first season in 2020. It's called The Future Of. And in each episode, I interview very interesting guests talking about the future of all kinds of different sectors of the economy and different aspects of the economy. We are launching season 2 in February, so you can check that out. If you want to listen online, you can go to atb.com/thefutureof, or you can always download the podcast on your podcasting app. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen. And I've gone a little bit longer, but I think we still have lots of time for Q&A, so I'll turn it over to Matt to moderate some of that.
That's great. Thanks, Todd. I could listen to you speak all day, so that's great. Thank you for the presentation. It really is. It's great, and there are lots of questions that have come in, so I'll sort of approach them in the order that they arrive to us. And so the first one was around, about that focus on the oil and gas industry and supporting the oil and gas industry, and whether it be around mitigation for environmental damage and abandoned wells, or exploring further oil fields. Like, the question really comes down to, should perhaps focus be placed on tourism development, and hoping that should we diversify?
This question of diversifying has been around forever, and I've been an economist in Alberta now for over 30 years, and the question's never really gone away. We tend to drop the question about diversifying when the economy is booming, and then when the economy is in trouble, the only thing that grows are seminars and conferences about how do we diversify the economy. And now it's the same question. I think rather than talking about diversifying, we need to talk about, because the lack of diversity is not really the problem. The lack of stability is the problem. The most economically diverse province in Canada is Manitoba. Wow. And I don't know if anyone, no disrespect to Manitoba, it's a lovely place, but I don't know if anyone really aspires to be, economically, if we could just be Manitoba. So it isn't really diversity that's Alberta's problem, it's instability, because our dominant industry, oil and gas, is subject to these wild ups and downs. So yeah, we do look at, well, how can we diversify the energy sector itself so it's not quite so dependent on one particular price, being crude oil. So diversifying Alberta's energy industry itself, I talked about renewables, I talked about clean energy tech. But yeah, other industries, technology and digital, tourism, agriculture, agri-foods. The challenge we have here in Alberta is that we could grow the biggest tech sector in the world, which would provide a lot of jobs, but it doesn't replace provincial government revenue. This is the hole we've dug ourselves into. Oil and gas is unique because that used to pay an enormous amount to our provincial coffers in terms of royalties. And we paid for a lot of stuff here in Alberta, universities and roads and hospitals and schools and no sales tax and everything else we've enjoyed here on those royalties. So we can diversify our economy, and that might be something we can do for sure. I think it's a good idea. But we also recognize that it doesn't solve the problem of undiversified provincial government revenue. That's, I think, the bigger problem.
And I mean, on that specific point, can you see a provincial sales tax becoming part of the...
Well, I have to remain... Yeah, it veers dangerously into politics, and I have to kind of avoid that. But every economist you talk to would advocate a consumption tax. That should be the very first kind of tax we look at. Let's get rid of these other kinds of tax on income or investment if we could. Consumption taxes are the best around, and why we don't have one in Alberta has always, sort of irked me. My prediction is within the next 3 to 5 years, under whatever government, it doesn't matter, that we will be looking at a consumption tax, simply because we're completely out of options.
Okay, yeah. That will be a tough political decision for sure. And that was one of the questions, actually. Are we anticipating, this is on federal, are we anticipating an election? Do you see that happening this year, federally?
A federal election? It's an interesting question. It's not my area of expertise at all. So I can't really offer a thought. I'm just as interested as everybody else if we're going to have. So I don't know.
That's great. Yeah, it's good. Always nice to have people's thoughts. And so how would you see the future for real estate industry, especially the home building sector? Do you think it would be demand for expanding the city? I'm assuming this is from Calgary or Edmonton, or people moving out. What do we think?
Yeah, well, in fact, the residential real estate market, it performed better than anyone expected in 2020. Considering it's the worst contraction we've seen since the Great Depression. Housing prices barely wobbled. I mean, albeit, we kind of came into COVID sort of hobbling along as an economy, so it wasn't rip roaring, but it held on okay. And I think in 2021, again, depending on the timing of that recovery, I think we could see, some of those people on that top end of the K recovery, the ones with money to spend, they might say now's the time to pull the trigger and build that home we've always wanted to build, or buy that condo downtown that we've always wanted to buy. So, I don't want to say I'm wildly optimistic about the residential retail, but I'm also not pessimistic. I think it actually might surprise us and do better than we think. And low interest rates are not going anywhere. So that will be very supportive of residential real estate.
Yeah, definitely. There was surprising things happening there. I mean, is there a fear that once some of this government support ends for individuals that we may see that impact through to real estate? We
will, but the people who are going to be hardest hit by the downside of the K are at least likely to be homeowners. They're going to be more renters, so it's a real question. What is going to happen to huge swaths of the population that are going to be unemployed? They probably will be carrying some debt, and those government support programs, end. But for real estate, I think you're more interested in that top end of the K, because those tend to be the ones who get into home ownership, buy homes, build homes.
Yeah. Thanks. And I know you mentioned that K, and it's going to be different for different groups, the nature of the recovery. And you may not have thought about this. I'm based in Brooks here, down in southeast Alberta, a rural community. Do you see potentially a rural-urban, any differences in the recovery in the future, or unique challenges that we're going to see in rural communities?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, because in some ways COVID may reverse this concentration into the urban core that we had been seeing as a general trend for 40 years, kind of a hollowing out of rural Alberta and a concentration into the big cities, because generally that's where the jobs were, and a concentration in the downtown core. But even before COVID, that was already starting to, ease up a little bit. And now, as we move through COVID, the idea that, well, actually, I don't need to, move my body into a downtown core anymore, at least not every day. Real estate, far less expensive in some of those rural areas. The idea that, well, maybe I could, live in Brooks and come into downtown Calgary once a week for some meetings, but otherwise I can work at home. I can have a bigger house, all these things around a smaller community that are appealing to a lot of folks. So we could start to see some of that. I don't know. So far, I don't think there's evidence that we are seeing it, but it could still happen. We're still, kind of halfway through COVID here. So. Yeah,
it's interesting. Like, before living in Brooks, I was living in London, and I know that amongst my friends there, it's making them ask questions, they were facing this downtown commute every day. And obviously it's not as bad in Calgary and Edmonton, but you can look at being further afield, certainly if you've got to make that trip once or twice a week. Okay, there are still lots of questions. If you've got time to take them, Todd.
Yeah, I got time for sure.
Perfect. So someone comments, I've read that it might be until 2023 or later until the economy fully recovers to normal pre-COVID levels. What do you think will be the industries or activities that will most drive this recovery? I know you've mentioned some of those. Will anything we used to do and put priority on no longer be around?
Yeah, well, when we think about Alberta, it's, we can talk about getting back to, recovery in a couple of ways. One is, when does the size of the economy, just the dollar value of everything we're producing and the goods and services, when does the size return to pre-COVID levels? And I think that we are looking at probably 23 or 24 before that happens. But then getting back to normal, I don't think the economy is ever going back to the composition of what it looked like pre-COVID. In other words, I think we are going to see new industries taking up the mantle of growth. Our energy industry, our traditional hydrocarbon production, I describe that as a backbone, but not a growth engine. And that had been a growth engine for decades in this province. It's taking on a new role. It's a backbone. You don't ignore your backbone. You want to make sure that's in good shape. But the growth is going to come from these other sectors, renewable and clean energy technologies. And I'm so optimistic for Alberta to become a world leader in these things, because I see it coming not necessarily from government. I see it coming from the business community. This is where there's a lot of buzz around how can we transform what we're doing here in Alberta and become a leader for not just Canada, but for the rest of the world in solving these problems around greenhouse gases. So I would say that one. But yeah, agriculture and agri-foods and technology and digital, the three that I outlined. I think by 23, 24, they are going to be much larger in size. So we will return to the size of our economy, but the composition does look different.
Okay. Yeah, and it sounds from what you say that you expect it perhaps to be broader. And that's excellent. Thank you. We do have quite, and I'm sure you have this quite often when you speak, we do have quite a few political sort of questions that I'm just not sure how.
Well, you can ask them. I don't know if I can answer them, but I'd love to hear what's on people's minds. So.
Okay. Okay. So speak to irrational government spending and central bank printing, stoking rising interest rates and inflation.
Well, that's everything around central banking and monetary policy. And this is a really interesting period of time. In fact, I was just listening in on a webinar that the Bank of Canada was holding yesterday, and they had a special guest, one of the governors of the U.S. Federal Reserve, but basically talking about where does monetary policy go from here on in? Because even looking back to 2008 and 2009 with the financial crisis, we saw central banks responding by basically, metaphorically, firing up the printing machine, dropping nuclear bombs of cash and liquidity on these economies. And there were lots of economists at the time that said, if you do this, we know from our textbooks that this is going to lead to runaway inflation and the US dollar is going to collapse, because we all learned this in our economics back in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and this is going to happen. But it didn't happen. It's now been 12 years since the financial crisis. There's not a whiff of inflation anywhere globally. In fact, deflation still holds a bigger threat. So it's really led a lot of economists to challenge the dogma, they would call it dogma, or I might just call it the conventional thinking from the 20th century around what happens if you print money and create more cash, because what's happened in the last 12 years has really challenged what we've always held as a truth. And I have to admit, as an economist, I used to work for the Bank of Canada. I feel my own dogma. I was in university back in the 80s, and this was pounded into our heads. The Phillips curve and everything else. You have to really control the money supply, or you're going to create big problems. But now a whole branch of thinking, modern monetary theory, is challenging all this notion. So I think monetary policy and what central banks do going forward is really being questioned. It's being challenged. We've amassed so much government debt. The modern monetary theorists are saying we don't need to worry about debt. If we have things to pay for, print money and pay for it. But the others, like me, are still saying that's still going to cause some problems. So I don't know if I have any answers to this, but I think we are at a really interesting point in history going forward. A lot of those textbooks are going to be rewritten, I think, over the next decade as we find out what happens when central banks continue to print money and push cash onto the economy.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. Yeah, it's sort of not worrying, but I think any time when the received wisdom is questioned, it's difficult.
Yeah.
Given your comments, this comes from Alan. Given your comments on government revenues, how much of a drag do you see coming from provincial fiscal consolidation in the coming years?
Fiscal consolidation.
Provincial fiscal consolidation in the coming years. I think probably talking about government spending cuts. Do we see?
Yeah, well, the one thing we do know from economic textbooks that still holds true is that anytime, government spending contracts or taxes go up, that does act as a drag on the economy. So either way, I mean, if you achieve fiscal balance in Alberta by reducing spending or raising taxes, reasonable people will debate which is the right way to do it. Either way, you don't get around the problem of it is going to constrict your economy in some way. So I know the current government, I mean, they're not here to speak to it, but I don't think they would be unabashed. They see the best way to go about doing this is to reduce the size of government. My guess is they may, sort of go a bit slower on some of that now that we're into COVID and post-COVID, simply because the economy really is quite fragile. But you also hear Premier Kenney saying things like now is not the time for a sales tax. Now, you notice he leaves himself a little bit of wiggle room in saying now is not the time. I don't hear him saying never a sales tax, but I would agree with him. Now is not the time for a new tax. But by the same logic, it's probably not the time for massive reduction in government spending. I think we have to be much slower and more patient with this. And I know that's tough for people to deal with. But our economy, the fragility of our economy right now is that's, I think, what we need to pay attention to.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Todd. And as we're coming up to sort of not very long left here, I'll just take one final question if you have time for that. And it really speaks to the group of people that we have here on the call. What role do you really see small businesses playing in the economic recovery? Like, is this
such an important role? I mean, small business has always been really a backbone of our economy. It doesn't get the headlines that the big giant oil companies get or the giant tech companies get. For obvious reasons, they're easy to, just look at one company. But small businesses, they are really the lifeblood of what's going on. And through COVID, I mean, you can't really sugarcoat this. It's been horrible for small businesses, especially a lot of the industries where we tend to see more small businesses, things like food services, things like tourism. It's been absolutely brutal for these so many small businesses. And my heart goes out to all these entrepreneurs that are struggling or that have lost business. Nonetheless, what I do firmly believe about Alberta is that we have an unlimited supply of entrepreneurial spirit. And as badly as it's been knocked down and those small businesses have suffered during COVID, I think it is going to come back even stronger in 2021 and beyond as we start to rebuild our economy and rebuild it in a different way. I talked about the composition of our industries or our economy changing and adapting. And I think the entrepreneurs in the province, the small businesses in the province, they're the ones that are going to be leading that evolution.
Yeah, that's great. And it's definitely what we've seen here at Business Link as well. We have a 1-800 number that to provide business support and connect people to resources. And obviously when that week in March hit, we had some very, very hard conversations with people who are facing tremendous difficulties. But within days, we saw those people seeking opportunities and the green shoots of new businesses starting and responding. So yeah,
Right.
we definitely see it.
And the book that you referenced, The Spiders in Space, Successfully Adapting to Unwanted Change, that book came out in 2017. My co-author and I, we are currently in the process of just finishing up a sequel called Spiders in COVID Space, where we capture some of the really compelling and inspiring stories of businesses that adapted during COVID. And what we found, I think it's fair to say, businesses don't adapt. Business owners adapt. They're the ones that do the adapting. So when you think about that, a business owner, his or her personal story of adapting might mean we wind up this business. It has a lifespan and it is over. But as a business owner, I now adapt and evolve into something new. And I think if we think about that, I mean, it's always sad to see a business go out of business. You know, it's just heartbreaking. But the business itself doesn't have feelings or emotions. It's the business owner. And the business owner is also the one that does the adapting. So I think there's always scope. Even if a business becomes unviable, the business owner and the adaptability of that person, that individual, that's where the success story is going to be.
Yeah, I think that's an important message for people. Yeah, definitely to think about the future, and it may be a completely different business, yeah, for them going forward.
Every business has a lifespan. Every single business has a lifespan.
Which is a way that so often very small business owners don't think of that, because it's so personal, isn't it?
I know. Yeah.
You know, the business doesn't have feelings, but the person does, and yeah, I completely.
And I empathize for them. Absolutely. It's tough. I've not been a small business owner, but many of my friends are, and I get it, how heartbreaking it is.
Yeah. Thank you for joining us. It's been great, Todd. I've really enjoyed your wisdom, and thanks for taking all that time to answer our questions there. We're just sharing the contact details for us here at Business Link. So if you do have any sort of follow-up questions or need any support at all, we're absolutely here for you with our 1-800 number, our email, but a great place to start really is on our website, where you can sign up for our newsletter, find out more events like this, and connect with us if you've got any questions about your business. We will send a recorded version. We have recorded versions of webinars and more workshops like this. So yeah, I'd like to say thanks again for attending today. You'll be sent a follow-up email just with an online survey. It's great for us to just get feedback and get an understanding of what people enjoy, what people find valuable, because it helps us with our future programming. So obviously I'd like to take this opportunity to thank everyone for attending and thank Todd again sincerely for sharing his presentation with us today. Thank you very much.